Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Erwin, president of the Council for a Better Louisiana. 3 years ago, the Deepwater Horizon rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico took 11 lives and set into motion what became the nation's largest oil spill. Just last week, the first phase of the civil trial against BP and 3 other companies came to a close. If found guilty of gross negligence, the parties could face penalties of up to $4,300 per barrel of oil spilled. The oil spill is just the latest assault against Louisiana's coast. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita inflicted their fury in 2005, further depleting wetlands and devastating coastal communities. Forecasters predict 9 hurricanes plus 4 major hurricanes for 2013. As global temperatures increase, researchers say we'll be facing more intense storms. Sea level rise compounded by subsidence will only accelerate Louisiana coastal land loss. So what is the state doing to combat its coastal concerns from BP and beyond?
Nearly 3 years after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, David Muth with the National Wildlife Federation brought reporters on a tour to observe the recovery of Louisiana's coast.
This is kind of ground zero in terms of oil impacts to marsh in Louisiana. This was one of the worst oiled places.
Bay Jimmy is located about 35 miles south of New Orleans, between Barataria Bay and the Gulf. Muth says that the crude oil from the spill arrived on the shore in sheets, with the more volatile components carried deep into the marsh by tidal waves.
Much of this end of the island here has eroded away since the spill. Some of that is part of the sort of background rate of erosion that we see anywhere in Barataria Bay, but some of it is presumably accelerated because vegetation was killed, rootstock was weakened by the oil.
In the National Wildlife Federation's recently released report, Restoring a Degraded Gulf of Mexico, the wetlands receive a poor grade 3 years after the spill. Harder to quantify, Muth says, is how far the toxic portions of the oil have traveled into the ecosystem.
Some of those chemicals are certain to have persisted in different organisms in the grass, in the things that eat the grass, in the things that eat the things that eat the grass. So that's kind of where we are right now.
The BP oil spill only exacerbated a Louisiana land loss progression that has claimed 1,880 square miles of coastline since the 1930s. With the introduction of the Mississippi River levee system following the Great Flood of 1927, the natural process of land production by the river was forever altered. The coastline that remains has been subject to hurricanes, subsidence, and sea level rise.
Well, as you can see behind us, this is a cemetery, and we did not build cemeteries in marsh. This land was actually at least 4 feet higher than it is today. We lost 3 feet of that to subsidence and probably 1 foot to sea level rise.
Windell Curole is director of the South Lafourche Levee District. He battles the forces of nature threatening his community by maintaining its storm protection systems.
We're building the levee as high as we can afford right now. How far into the future, I don't know. Can't guarantee that we won't have to raise it some more, or that it will get too expensive to raise and that we'll finally have to move out.
Communities like Curole's and others along the coast are being given additional lines of defense from the state's 2012 Coastal Master Plan.
The master plan has 2 primary objectives. One of them is restoring the coast, and the other one is protecting communities.
Garret Graves is chair of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. The CPRA was created by the state legislature in 2006 to address coastal land loss. Graves says the state's 2012 master plan uses the resources that are realistically available to combat the problem.
This is the first plan that's ever been developed in Louisiana that's truly resource constrained. Constrained by the dollars, constrained by the sediment we have, and constrained by the fresh water. $50 billion, 50-year plan is what we have.
Among the measures in Louisiana's comprehensive master plan, rebuilding barrier islands, which buffer storm surges, creating marshes by pumping in dredged materials, and using sediment diversions which divert a river's course to lay down new land.
The sediment diversions are the most efficient means of restoring the coast in terms of the number of acres we can get per dollar. And just to give you a quick statistic, in the master plan, we call for spending about $20 billion in marsh creation projects. It's the largest single component of our master plan, but that only builds about 200 square miles of land. On the other hand, we call for about $4 billion in sediment diversions, and we're going to build 50% more land. We're going to build 300 square miles of land with $4 billion in sediment diversions.
But diversion projects take time, cautions Meade Allison, a coastal scientist with the Water Institute of the Gulf.
People need to realize that this is a long-term commitment to something that may be 30 to 50 years before you see significant land building.
River diversions have also caused concern among oyster growers and commercial fishers who worry about the effects of changing salinity levels. Coastal scientists say these fears are unfounded. While Graves says all residents of the state deserve protection, it's not realistic to expect it based on the available funds. The master plan shows projects that give the most protection and restoration bang for the buck.
We have already, to a large degree, drawn that line in the sand and said, this is what we believe we can protect, what we believe we can restore. For those folks that are below the line, for those communities that are below the line, despite the fact that they don't deserve to be left out, no one does. What we've done is we have put together relocation packages and elevation of home packages the most efficient manner we can in order to provide assistance to them and not leave anyone stranded.
As coastal communities plan for a future of shifting shorelines, new research being conducted at LSU School for the Coast and Environment will try to determine all the competing costs involved in the battle.
The reason why they're very interested in our project is that this would be the first time that we try to incorporate both the natural and the human environmental factors into the project to look at the coastal sustainability problem.
The National Science Foundation has awarded Dr. Nina Lamb and other LSU faculty a $1.5 million grant to identify how natural and human components along coastlines are linked. The data generated will help coastal communities worldwide make more informed planning decisions.
If we can has a model to show the trade-off, like if you do something here, you would increase the cost of living, or if you do something there, you would increase the subsidence rate. Then we can look at the different trade-off in order to do further planning.
When it comes to the cost of the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, Muth says the National Wildlife Federation's hope is that all parties are held accountable, and any money received goes towards the type of projects that Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan advocates.
The master plan actually gives us an opportunity to turn the corner, to go from a system that is in some stage of permanent decline to a system that will eventually reach equilibrium and start growing again. And we'd like to see the money that comes to the state from that and to the federal agencies from that be used for that purpose, for real restoration.
Thanks to LPP producer Christina Melton for letting us include excerpts from her Turning the Tide documentary. Joining us in our studio to discuss Louisiana's coastal concerns are residents from Baton Rouge, Lafayette, Alexandria, and Jennings. We have members of the Louisiana Wildlife Federation, the Coastal Conservation Association, and the Legislative Youth Advisory Council. We're also joined by Leadership Louisiana alumni and Ochsner's Golden Opportunity Group. And welcome everyone to Louisiana Public Square tonight. LSU's Public Policy Research Lab surveyed over 140 citizens on tonight's topic. Among the survey responses, when asked if the state as a whole or just Louisiana's southeastern coast was affected by the BP oil spill, 71% of respondents said the state as a whole, while just under a quarter, 24%, chose just the southeastern coast. 5% were unsure. When given a choice of where the majority of recovery money from BP should be spent, among the top answers were coastal restoration, given by 45% of those surveyed, Wildlife and Fisheries and payments to individual citizens were each chosen by 17% of respondents, and disaster preparedness is where 8% of those surveyed recommend spending most of the money recovered. And while 65% of respondents say yes, living on Louisiana's coast is a personal risk, as opposed to 28% who say no, 72% of those surveyed feel government should aid those who take this risk after a disaster strikes, but 22% say no, government shouldn't assist those who choose to live along the coast following a disaster. And when asked if low-lying areas of coastal Louisiana are beyond saving, 71% of respondents said no, while 24% said yes. So let's start there. Given limited resources, is it really realistic to think we can save all of Louisiana's coast? And if not, how do we determine who are the winners and losers? George, you're with the Coastal Conservation Association. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, the public at large needs to understand that this whole process, the master plan, is not going to be all restoration. We're not going back to the year 1930. There's parts of the coastal scene that can be saved, other parts where we can restore. But there will be winners and losers in this, and it's going to be tough for people who feel like they're being shorted to accept the master plan as it's laid out now.
Well, I guess as Garret Graves mentioned in the piece we saw earlier, we are restricted by resources in a lot of different ways, and it's just, I guess, a reality that people are going to have to deal with one way or the other, just like we deal with the BP disaster in the hurricane situation.
Well, in the form of resources, there are parts of the state where water can't be delivered through diversion projects, and there's no way to send sediment into those areas because they're too far away from the Mississippi River or other resources. So it's sad, but there are some parts of the state that are going to have a tough time.
Well, let me ask you, this is a statewide issue in many ways because even the respondents in our survey responded to that they thought it was important to the state. What about you? I mean, you're a group from different parts of the state, some from coastal areas, some not. Is this a top priority for our state, in your opinion? Sarah?
I think it absolutely is. I think about James Carville 3 years ago when he was speaking immediately after the BP oil spill. He said, a lot of people talk about a way of life, or quality of life rather, but in Louisiana we have a way of life, and that's worth protecting and preserving. And to your point, some will be winners and some will be losers, but overall I think the state is impacted tremendously by what happens along the coast.
Well, Rob, let me ask you, you're from Alexandria, and that's not typically considered a coastal community, but obviously you're here and you have some concerns about things too. What's your perspective on that as somebody that's not immediately affected in a coastal sort of way, but are a citizen of the state?
I'd agree with her. I think that a tremendous part of our character and culture is tied up in southern Louisiana, and as we lose that, we're also losing part of our character, and it's worth, from a cultural standpoint, protecting it. It's also important. The fisheries are incredibly important for not just South Louisiana, but a huge part of our nation. And from a personal standpoint, I think it's important from a recreation standpoint.
Yeah, obviously a lot there, and the fisheries, of course, and the whole maritime industry, so much going on. Jalissa, let me ask you, you're a student at Southern University. You haven't been around as long as a lot of the folks who've seen a lot of these things, so I don't know how new of an issue this is to you, but it's certainly one that's going to have a big impact over your lifetime, or at least in our state over that lifetime. What do you think?
Definitely. I think it really is a pressing concern that needs to be addressed, considering the universities that this is a part of our campus. So I think it should be a statewide effort to fix this.
Let me ask you something else, too. One of the questions was, do you think that we can do this? There's a lot of very intricate science involved in this. We have studied this for a long time. We've actually kind of changed direction from the past to where we are right now with the master plan. Are y'all confident that we can do this as a state? Rebecca, you're with the...
Oh, yes, I am. When you go to the mouth of the Atchafalaya River and the Wax Lake Delta, you can see land being built. Land has been built there. So the opportunity is there to use what built all of South Louisiana. So I'm optimistic, though I recognize the challenges for these kinds of dilemmas about what you spend your money toward, what resources are getting prioritized. So, but I'm optimistic, and I'm glad to hear the public feels that it's doable and worth saving.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It is, a lot of folks don't live around the coastal area, but obviously it has gotten a lot of response from people around the state. John, you had something. You're a student at Southern as well.
Yes, I was just wanting to reiterate that I think it would be a great opportunity to be able to conduct more research here. One of the experiences that I had was traveling to Alaska to conduct environmental research on the Bering Glacier. So the same type of technology, and I was working with renowned geologists and scientists from around the world. That same type of technology can be used here along the coastal lines to figure out answers and problems and to be able to provide a solution as to be able to circumvent the effects that are happening, so forth.
And we really are kind of at ground zero for this in so many ways, for the country obviously, but the world in many ways too. And we do have a lot of research and a lot of institutions doing really good coastal research here in Louisiana. Wallace, you're a student and you were from Cameron Parish, so I think you probably have had quite a different kind of perspective in some ways maybe on the coastal issues. What do you think?
Yes, sir. I do think that we need to start somewhere, how it needs to be done, but our coast is what Louisiana is about, and after hurricanes and other disasters, it has eroded a lot, and I think that something needs to be done to help people feel more aware of moving down there back to their hometowns of like Cameron and help the population increase.
One of the questions that came up a couple of times is whether we should be, putting extra resources to help people live along the coast, even if they're going to be at risk and at threat from whether it be hurricanes or other kind of disasters. Should they be living around the coast? Mindy, what do you think?
Do we ask people to move away from the San Andreas Fault? Do we ask them to, completely abandon the areas where there are sinkholes? Do we displace people that are in Tornado Alley? No. I mean, they may choose to through their own benefit risk analysis of where they're going to live. And living in southern coastal Louisiana has inherent risks, and there are necessary precautions that must be taken. But to say that all of these people who live in these low-lying areas need to now uproot themselves after potentially hundreds or generations of people to then move away, in some cases it is necessary. It has gotten to the point of no return that they can't go back. But in other areas, there are ways to shore up the shore, so to speak, and they should not be asked to leave.
And certainly we have a lot of industry and a lot of resources that really the whole country depends on that are located in those very areas. I wanted to ask you one other question. Garret Graves mentioned in the piece that we saw earlier about the price tag. Most of this is federal money, a lot of money coming from BP, but $50 billion, 50 years, $50 billion. The state is, to a large degree, running this effort, trying to save the coast. It's a big, massive project. Chris, I just want to ask you used to work for the state. I'm not picking on you for that reason, but does that give you any concern that the state can manage a $50 billion program and do it in the right way?
Every time something happens, people want to throw money at it. Rather than sit down and look at the problem and discuss it and find out what we can do without throwing money at it to get the problem under control. Whether the state can do it with $50 million or $500 million, $50 billion, or $500 billion, I really don't know. I never was in that aspect of it, but the old adage is, it's easier to give somebody something than to take it away from them. And I know the people down on the coast don't want anything given to them. They just want the coastal erosion that's been happening for long before BP. Every time I picked up a documentary or saw a documentary or picked up something, they always showed it where it's getting further back and further back and further back. So have we really come to the conclusion of how to do what we need to do? Well,
let's hold it right there, because we're going to have our panel of experts in a minute, and we're going to come right back to you. And we got some more people I know that have some questions. We're going to do that. So that's all we have time for in this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further explore Louisiana's coastal concerns. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're discussing how Louisiana is responding to its coastal concerns. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Garret Graves is the chair of the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. The authority currently oversees a $17 billion coastal and hurricane protection and oil spill recovery program. Following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, Graves was appointed by President Obama to the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force. Windell Curole has worked as the general manager of the South Lafourche Levee District for the past 33 years, overseeing hurricane and flood protection projects. Mr. Curole holds a BS in biology and has twice earned the National Hurricane Conference Award for dedication to hurricane and flood protection. Dr. Christopher Delia is a professor and dean of LSU School of the Coast and Environment. Prior to joining LSU, he worked at the University of South Florida. He is currently serving a second 3-year term as a member of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of the United Nations. And Mark Schleifstein is the environmental reporter for NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. He's worked at the media group since 1984, most recently covering the Deepwater Horizon civil trial. His reporting on the BP oil disaster received recognition by the Scripps Howard Foundation, and his coverage of Hurricane Katrina earned him a Pulitzer Prize. Now, before we go to our audience for their questions, if each of you could each tell us briefly from your own perspective, how is Louisiana faring 3 years following the BP oil spill? How are we handling things right now? Garret, can we start with you?
Sure. I think that to think that we're 3 years after the spill, we still have 200 miles of oiled shoreline. We still have about 1.2 million barrels of oil that's unaccounted for in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't think that Louisiana is faring too well. Last point is that if you look at how these settlements were reached with the private businesses, they were reached with the conclusion that all this was going to be over in 2 to 3 years, and clearly we're on a trajectory for this to last much longer.
Windell Curole, you are down there sort of at ground zero too. You're in Lafourche Parish. What do you see 3 years out?
Well, as much oil as came out, as bad as that disaster looked like it was going to be, I agree with Garret 100% as far as that side of it. But I was able to go last summer, do some crabbing at Fouchon, and when the crab slowed down, I put the fishing line out, started catching white trout. I knew I didn't have bait on the line when I wasn't getting a bite. That's how good it had gotten. So it's a mixed bag. My big concern is that we were going to see some terrible things like happened in Alaska. But because of our area being the way it is, it has bounced back better than I thought from that perspective. But again, going back to what Garret said, I agree with 100% that this coast, as valuable as it is to this country, has not been treated correctly. And it's very important that we spend the money where the oil went. And this delta is important for the entire Gulf. We just hope that the government and the people with the money put it where it's supposed to be spent.
Dr. Delia, you're a researcher at LSU. You're going to be doing a lot of work ongoing on the coastal piece itself in terms of the marshes and that, but also the human element. I'm just wondering what you're seeing at this early stage of things after 3 years.
Well, it's a mixed bag. I think the others are very correct in what they stated. The one thing you can't forget is that Louisiana was hit the hardest of all the states, and I'm not sure that necessarily hit home in other parts of this country. But what Garret said is absolutely correct. There is a lot of oiled marsh still. There was a lot of oiled marsh, and certain parts of it are going to recover better than others. Our scientists at LSU have shown that insect populations have been knocked back in marshes, so they don't look like the same normal healthy marshes that you would expect. But in other cases, the marshes have shown their resilience, and that's good news for us. And thank God the seafood industry is, although it's been affected in terms of yield perhaps, it's still safe to eat Louisiana food, and I think that's something people need to understand.
Mark, you've been reporting on this and other things for many years, certainly on environmental issues. From your perspective as a reporter, having been so close to so much of this for such a long period of time, what are you seeing down there?
Well, I'm actually looking at this as an extremely dark cloud that might actually have a silver lining for the state of Louisiana, in that there's a significant portion of the money that will come out of the BP fines, whoever those fines are actually levied against, that will end up in the state used to help rebuild our wetlands, that will provide us with that shot in the arm that the state's been looking for the last 15 to 20 years to start our coastal restoration program. That's the positive part. The negative part is that there are still significant problems with the economy that people are still trying to get over as a result of what happened during the spill, especially amongst fishermen. And we need to figure out exactly what kinds of long-term effects might actually be occurring to wildlife.
And that's going to be an ongoing thing, certainly. You mentioned the investment that's going to be made in the coast, and I think Jacqueline had a question kind of to that point, trying to figure out what about that money, where is it all going? Jacqueline, what was your question?
Well, I've read that 80% of the money received from suits will go toward coastal restoration, and I'm wondering specifically which agencies will be in charge of that, and specifically where will the other 20% go?
Garrett, you probably are a good one to answer that.
In the case of Louisiana, under the federal law that dedicates those penalties, it is the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority that is the state agency that will be governing those dollars. It will be limited toward the state's master plan for coastal restoration, for hurricane protection projects. The remaining 20% goes back to Washington, D.C., goes to the federal government, to the Treasury. And I think it's also important to note that while those penalties are a significant component of the overall recovery, there are a number of other pots of funding associated with this to recover the environment, to recover the businesses, to recover the communities that are still out there that could actually be even more funding than the Restore Act or Clean Water Act funds that will be coming, the 80% of which will be coming to the 5 Gulf states.
Let me just ask quickly on the BP piece of it too. Do we know how much, or I guess we know the range of out there, but can you describe the range of those dollars that may be coming in? Because that's on top of the things that have happened, some of the stuff that's happened earlier.
Sure. A few of the categories, the state and the parishes all have economic losses, loss of tax dollars as a result of the energy decline, the tourism losses. That, I think, cumulatively will be in the billions of dollars. You have the Restore Act, or the penalties associated with the actual release of oil into the environment. You could potentially factor in natural gas and dispersants and others. That range right now, most folks land somewhere between about $3.5 billion on the low end and up perhaps to $20 billion on the high end. Again, 80% of which would come to the state. And the last other major funding source out there is the natural resource damages. And that is for all the birds that were killed, the fish that were killed, the wetlands that were oiled, the water and air quality impacts. All of those impacts are required to be mitigated or remediated by BP, and projections for that activity across the 5 Gulf states is estimated to be somewhere in the $10 to $12 billion range.
Go ahead.
Just real quick, just say that of the 80%, the state will get the largest portion of that, but it will be shared with other states along the coast. So we'll get maybe 30%, 40% of the 80% if we're lucky. 25, 30, something like that. And the reality is that there are 2 federal agencies that also will be getting a share of that money, and they're likely to be building at least some of the projects that they'll be building with that money in Louisiana as well. So it really is a mix.
Windell Curole? Those other agencies should be spending the money in Louisiana. Again, because you live in a democracy and tyranny of the majority, we are a small populated state. The first $1 billion, with $500 million of it was shared equally. Texas got $100 million. Louisiana got $100 million. Texas got a bucket full of tar balls, and we had the sludge on our coast that lasted for months. That's not fair. But that's you have to do what you have to do in a democracy when you're outnumbered. But those agencies can spend a large share of that money and should spend a large share of that money in Louisiana. But not only because it's Louisiana. We have this delta that is important to the entire nation and the entire Gulf. Just because it's in Louisiana, it shouldn't be treated like it's just a Louisiana thing. It's about the nation and about the Gulf of Mexico.
If I could,
yes.
there's some positive aspects to the money being shared throughout the whole Gulf. There is the prospect of us doing more comprehensive observation and monitoring than we've ever done before, and that can be done on a Gulf-wide basis. So we in the scientific community are very enthusiastic about that prospect. And that really does need to have a Gulf-wide perspective, as I said. The other thing that we need to really do is to monitor and understand how our restoration efforts are. It's not enough to just say, let's go out and restore something. We need to follow along scientifically and make sure that we are getting the kind of positive results we say. So I think that's another positive event.
Let me ask you real quickly. BP has sort of said that some of our claims are over-exaggerated, that the harm to the state has not been as great as some have alluded to. What's the response to that? I mean, obviously we're all from Louisiana, but is that legal talk, or is that something?
I think it's entirely posturing by BP. They were pointing specifically to some numbers. I think it was the cumulative numbers that were submitted by parishes, counties, and states across the Gulf Coast, and it totaled, as I recall, somewhere around $34 billion perhaps. And that was a whole bunch of claims, and ultimately there'll be a methodology to determine the economic losses, and it'll be applied uniformly across the Gulf Coast. But that is the stab that I think the states, the parishes, and the counties came up with on their first cut.
Even besides that, though, we say BP is a company, but at least we can say on that rig, on those decisions, they made decisions that we all suffered from. They took risks to help out their bottom line, and they hurt the bottom line of people all over the Gulf. And so it's, from the beginning, they talked about it and it's going to be a business aspect. It's a business. I think BP, and we encourage their work in the future, done in the right way. But all companies, there's always that, two edges to the sword. And when it's a disaster, it's a terrible disaster. I have friends who work at deep offshore oil. They know once they started going off of the continental shelf, you could not afford a mistake. And most of the people working out there do a good job. Dr. B, who was on the panel that wrote a report for the president, said if he had been in charge instead of a moratorium, he said he could take in teams of 4 and 5 people. There were 33 projects out in the Gulf. He said he might have slowed down 3 or 4, but most of the people out there are doing a real good job. But the people on that rig making that decision should pay a heavy penalty for the damage they did. The other people doing it right should be applauded and patted on the back, because we do need the oil.
Mindy, you had a question of sort of a personal level about some decision you're trying to make about whether to move more towards the coast. You're in Lafayette. You want to ask the panel about that, whether it's a good idea?
My husband and I, our 5-year plan, we have older children. They're teenagers and 2 in college, and we're at the point where we're thinking we're going to build a homestead. Louisiana, South Louisiana is home. We've moved away, we come back. We've moved away, we've come back. This is home. And we're going to stay here. And we want to encourage our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren to live here. And in choosing where to live, it's not, it's a good neighborhood for the next 10 years. We're choosing what my husband and I refer to as our forever home, or our century home. And when we think about, we're from Lafayette, and we'd like to move south of Lafayette, but we're trepidatious. We're scared. We think maybe we should be moving at least a little bit north.
So the question is really, is it wise to do that? To
Right.
move south? Is it safe? I don't know. Dr. Delia?
Yeah, living near the coast always has some dangers in it.
Yeah.
We're in a world where more and more people are living near the coast, and people have to accept that there's a certain amount of risk in doing that. There are severe storms. There are other problems such as we have here in Louisiana, but we can do things to protect ourselves and to reduce our personal risk.
Let me. Go ahead.
7 out of my 8 great-grandparents were on the coast at Shanghai Caminada. After the hurricane of 1893, they retreated 12 miles from the coast of Leeville, Golden Meadow, 22 miles, Cut Off, 35 miles. The hurricane of 1915 hit. 3 out of my 4 grandparents grew up in Leeville, retreated. I grew up 35 miles from the coast. Problem is, because of this subsidence issue, because of this land loss and sea level rise, the Gulf has gotten closer to everybody, especially in southeast Louisiana, and then we're seeing the effects in southwest Louisiana. You have to face the risk and the reality of it. And if you face it and you look at it, you can make a wise decision. But we live in a very unique place, those of us who live in southeast Louisiana. There's no place like it. when you're 10 years old and you can go feed your family. A lot of people, kids throughout the United States cannot, that empowers you. It makes you a little bit different, and that's why our communities are different. It's a giving place when it's good, but like most deltas, and there's only 7 great deltas, we've got one of them, there's always great opportunity and great risk, and you got to face both of them. You can't just look at the good stuff, and you can't just look at the bad, and your decisions have to be made inside of that. But I believe it's supposed to be, you take care of yourself, and don't, try to be fair. Port Fourchon helps support what the national government gets $6 billion a year from the leases and royalties. We don't get any of that until in a few years because we threaten a lawsuit to be treated fairly. But the point is, there's always there's going to be those risks and those threats, and you have to sit in between there and judge it. But it is your personal responsibility.
Dr. D, let me get back to you for a second. You've got some research that you're doing at LSU that looks at, both the marsh situation, but also the human element of things. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Has that revealed anything yet, or are there some things out of the context of what you're looking at that could kind of answer that question broadly for people?
Well, as your lead piece said, Dr. Lamb runs a National Science Foundation sponsored program to try to understand the competing risks and benefits that the human populations have to deal with, and economic issues are a big part of that. She has done all kinds of really interesting things in the past, such as looking at economic recovery after Hurricane Katrina, and I think the same kinds of methodologies are very applicable in this case.
George, you had a question?
I have a question for Garret. With the potential of billions of dollars coming into the state through various sources, what plans does the state have to assist the recreational fishing sector? So many people believe might be the best fishing grounds in the world. What plans does the state have to help us rebound our community?
We have plans right now to go help build additional artificial reefs. We have plans to build additional stock enhancement and research facilities. We have plans to improve access to recreational fishing, whether it be through piers, through education, and other types of approaches. So we're working right now with CCA and with other entities to put together that comprehensive recreational fishing program, so where we don't just go do a reef here and a boat ramp there, but to where we actually have a comprehensive program to where you have connectivity between, among all the different components, the education, the access, and the actual research and species enhancement.
Mark, let me ask you, you have done some reporting on some of this, especially with regard to different projects, diversion projects and those types of things, and the impact that it has on fisheries and on, I guess, both commercial and recreational fishing. Tell us about that issue. What's the conflict there? What's the situation that's kind of driving that?
Well, I think one of the bigger concerns is amongst commercial fishermen and some recreational fishermen that the use of freshwater diversions will cause the fish that they traditionally have gone after to disappear, to change from saltwater to more freshwater. And also there's concern about the loss of wetlands, especially based on the effects of the Carnarvon freshwater diversion. And the problem is that the diversions that are being talked about as part of this plan are going to cause some of those problems, but more importantly, they're going to be building land, and they're not designed as freshwater diversions. They're designed as diversions that will increase the amount of sediment that's grabbed from the river during high river years and put it out into the wetland areas and grow things. Yes, fishermen will be impacted by that. We don't know exactly what those impacts will be, but there will be some, and there will have to be something done about that financially as we move forward with that, and that's going to be one of the key issues that the state and the federal government are going to have to deal with as they move forward with this, because those kinds of things will go into the decision-making process for the permits that are required to approve all these projects.
It's back to that winners and losers thing. Yeah, Dr. Dealey?
One has to remember that there are always competing interests in any kind of environmental problem. And in this case, keeping the maritime commerce going on the Mississippi is a very important thing for the state and the nation. And the way we do that has caused real problems with the ability of sediment to reach the coast. And most estimates that I've seen show that only about half of the amount of sediment that we really need is getting to the coast. And that's the challenge.
We want to go back to our audience. Wallace had a question, and I think John did too. But Wallace,
first off, I wanted to say that I'm from Cameron Parish, and what I was wondering is what has been done since hurricanes and the BP spill, not only in Cameron Parish but beyond, to help with coastal erosion and restoring the coast, as well as with tourism and with, as we said, the fishing industry, such as the shrimping industry. And how long do you think it'll be before it was back like it was before the BP oil spill there?
Garret?
In Cameron Parish, in fact, in all of Southwest Louisiana, I think that it's really distinguished from Southeast Louisiana in that there were not as many projects and programs that had been in the planning process prior to Hurricane Rita, prior to the BP oil spill. In the next few months, we're going to be pulling the trigger on about a $70 million project to protect the Cameron shoreline down there south of Highway 82, to help restore and harden that shoreline to make it more sustainable and prevent some of the future erosion that's going to occur there. We're also working on a lock or floodgate structure in the Calcasieu River to prevent further saltwater intrusion, which is coming in and causing land loss in Cameron Parish and the Calcasieu Parish. We've also spent in excess of $20 million beneficially using dredge material from those navigation channels and restoring wetlands with that money. In fact, it's the largest beneficial use of dredge material in the state of Louisiana over in Cameron and southern Calcasieu parishes. So there are a lot of efforts underway. On the tourism side, we were able to reach an agreement with BP back in October, maybe early November of 2010, where we did get them to come in and agree to make a tourism grant to different entities and parishes in the state of Louisiana to advocate tourism back in the state of Louisiana, get tourists back, let them know that these parishes are open for business. Lastly, when are things going to be back to normal? It is incredible to me that we can be here 3 years later. We're in the United States of America. We have this great country, this powerful government, this good justice system, and BP is out there spending over $100 million on commercials telling the United States and all these Americans that everything's fine, that they're going to make it right and everything's great. When in reality, they have spent less money, in fact, significantly less money, on actually doing restoration work in the Gulf, recovering those fisheries, than they spent on those commercials. That is absolutely absurd. And I'll tell you that we're all very frustrated. We are trying to use the court system to the best of our ability to make sure that everything is fully recovered and we can come back and proudly stand up in front of all the residents of South Louisiana and the entire state and say that we did what was right and we have a good deal and we're going to recover the state of Louisiana.
I want to go back to the audience questions in a minute too, but first, Mark, let me ask you, you've been covering the BP trial. It's a complicated affair for those trying to keep up with, but it's even more complicated when you see the pieces and parts, that there's the civil trial, part 1, part 2, all of that. Can you very briefly kind of lay that out for us and explain how that is working in ways that we can possibly understand?
Well, last week, the first portion of the trial, the first phase of the trial ended without a conclusion, as a lot of this is expected to continue to do. That first phase was to determine liability amongst the players, i.e. BP, Halliburton, and Transocean. Transocean owned the rig. Halliburton was the company that put the cement down the well. And BP, of course, owned the well and controlled all the other operators, everybody else. They're the ones who were in charge. They designed the plan for drilling and were regulating them as they move forward. So what the judge has to do is determine, first of all, what percentage of the blame should be given to each one of those, if a percentage of the blame should be given to any of them. And then he has to go beyond that and say, did their actions go beyond just regular, and I have a problem with this word, just doing it to me again. Whether or not the responsibility that they have is beyond negligence to gross negligence. If they're found to be gross negligent, what happens is that, number one, the Clean Water Act fines go up from the $110 per $1,100 per barrel to $4,300 per barrel. But in addition, it also allows the private claimants to come back in and say, well, if that's true, if they were grossly negligent, then we need to get additional damages out of you. So it could be a huge amount of money for everybody if that happens. But in addition to that, the judge also has the ability to, and usually they do, say, well, I agree with all that, they're gross negligent, but I'm only going to say that they have to pay 2/3 of the maximum amount of fines because they've actually taken this action and this action to ameliorate the damage, and they've moved quickly to do things, those sorts of things. So all of that is in abeyance. And the second phase says, okay, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at everything from the time the rig stopped burning and it sank to the time when you plug the well permanently, and how much are the damages for that, and how much oil actually spilled. And those numbers will be used to determine how much the fines are and how much the damages are. And that doesn't even begin until September, and it could take another 2 to 3 months. And then there may be a third set of legal issues involving things that weren't thought of during those first two phases.
And I guess then we'll start the appeal process. Is that?
Well, the appeals process has already started.
Well,
there are already rulings.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
And then there was the criminal phase last fall too.
Right.
Let me go back to the audience. And John, you had a question for our panel.
I do. In the past, to deal with oil spills, bioremediation has been used. Now, obviously, along this point, bioremediation isn't the only solution. So my question is there actually concrete research or alternative methods now to be able to alleviate the problem of the oil spill?
Well, I'm probably the one to answer that. There is no question that bioremediation has been used on a pilot basis. But the challenge is getting it out to the vast areas that, as Garret referred to, have been affected. And so it's not that easy to do. And that, I think, has been one of the reasons that it's been problematic. It's also, I think, a kind of a permitting issue that certain agencies don't really want it to happen.
About 2.5% of the money that is part of the Restore Act goes into research. And part of that research will be looking at bioremediation and also looking at alternatives to core exit and other things like that can be used for making the oil disappear before it gets to shore. Those sorts of things are still out there. The problem that it seemed to happen as bioremediation was being proposed at the very beginning of this was there were really serious concerns about, well, is that going to make things worse, and or how much of that stuff do you actually have to put out there for it to work with this much oil? Is that going to make things worse? So that's where they are right now.
And I would just comment that there's also the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, which was a $500 million research fund established by BP, and they have been engaging in research on dispersants. For example, there's a Tulane center that is focusing on essentially building a better mousetrap, a better dispersion.
Let me ask you this, just because it was in the news quite a bit. What was the final verdict ever on the berms? Were they good? Were they bad? Were they indifferent?
The berms on the east side. Well, first of all, I think it's important to put things in context. The shoreline of Louisiana from the state of Texas to Mississippi is about 7,800 miles. If you measure that smoothly, it's a fraction of that amount. It's just several hundred miles. So the idea is that clearly BP wasn't prepared for this oil spill. They weren't prepared to respond to it. They're still not. And so we were trying to find ways to shorten the shoreline. How can we take this fight to a few hundred miles as opposed to thousands of miles? One of the solutions that was proposed by a Dutch research entity was building the berms to help shorten the shoreline. We brought in sediment from the Mississippi River system and other places and built berms. Those berms, particularly on the west side of the Mississippi River, are now being fortified into barrier islands, historic barrier islands, right there on the footprint. So the sediment that was put there is served as the foundation. We have almost completed restoring all of Pelican Island. We now have a 21-mile pipeline coming out of the Mississippi River. We're restoring Schofield Island. We have plans in the near future to restore Shell Island, which would therefore take all of the foundation from the berms and use that as barrier island restoration. On the east side of the river, on the Chandelier Islands, studies that we had done about a year ago indicated that because of the configuration and the additional sediment that was put into the system, you actually had an increase in sediment. I will admit it is of a different configuration. It's not as high as it was before, but there was actually more sediment in the system based upon the analysis they did about a year ago because of the configuration and the way that the waves were washing, the tides were washing through and bringing sediment in behind the Chandelier Islands.
And that's a part that's probably not as well known. So, Rebecca, you had a question.
Yeah, when will we know the data results from the NRDA collection?
And tell us what NRDA is.
The Natural Resource Damage Assessment. So it's informing, right, some of the process, but we don't know what it is. And I am concerned about what's happened with marine wildlife. It's, excuse me, not as visible, but what can we know and when can we know that?
Because all of this is a litigation process. All of these studies are underway, and in fact, there are about 200 different analyses, everything from the insects that Dr. Delia mentioned to whales and everything in between. And so all of those assessments are underway. In addition to that, the state of Louisiana and other entities are doing our own assessments to make sure that we're protecting Louisiana's interest, in addition to the ones we're doing with BP. Right now, I can tell you, we're seeing decreases in shrimp reproduction. We're seeing significant impacts on oysters, even fish like tuna and mahi-mahi. National Wildlife Federation released a report last month that indicated that you had 20% reduction in reproductive rates. We're seeing lesions on red snappers. We're seeing some of the greatest mortality rates on dolphins and other species that have ever been seen before in the United States, period. Longer and higher rate of death than ever before. So we're seeing impacts and we're trying to communicate that information. But until we make it through probably this third phase of the trial that Mr. Schleifstein was referring to earlier, we probably will not have disclosure of a lot of this stuff because of the sensitive nature of the litigation that we're in.
Mark, you had a quick...
Yeah, that's, as a member of the media, I will say that one of the most frustrating things for me has been the natural resource damage assessment process, and it's something that there are some real problems with the Oil Pollution Act, and they all start with the fact that the way the Oil Pollution Act is set up is that it requires the federal government to enter into a partnership with the responsible party. And then it requires them, as through the natural resource damage assessment process, to act as partners on the research, so that one will be doing research and looking over the shoulder of the other people doing research. And if they're able to all agree on something, if it does go to court, both sides are on an equal basis in the court. But if either side says, we're not going to play this game, that person, that side, then gets stuck in court with having to prove the opposite side wrong instead of having the opposite side prove them right, which is a real detriment under the law, but it's a detriment to the public in that none of the information gets out because of this whole legal issue. It puts it all under wraps until things are finished, and that's a real problem. And it keeps popping up wherever you go. A couple of weeks ago, there was a problem with an oil spill in Arkansas, and a reporter was almost arrested because she went to the site where the cleanup was being run, and the company that was running it said, if you don't get off this property, we'll arrest you. And nobody in the federal government said, no, you can't do that because they're the media.
So you're suggesting some slight ironies in all of this.
Right.
Garret?
This process is absolutely crazy. Just to give an analogy of what Mark is talking about, this is like having a murderer, somebody who just shot somebody else, coming in and telling the police what they can study and investigate and what they can't. In this case, BP has total governance over the investigation. It is the craziest thing. It's one of the fundamental flaws in federal law in this case, and it absolutely needs to be fixed.
Yeah, Dr. Delia,
well,
everybody likes this part of it.
We could probably do a whole hour on this topic alone. And we're all frustrated with it for a variety of reasons. I'm frustrated by the Oil Pollution Act because it prevents scientists from getting a hold of data. And a lot of useful information that we really could use should be there. The other problem with the Act is that there is no real provision for accompanying research to be done at the moment the spill occurs. So we couldn't get out there and find out what was going on as the spill started to break as a real problem. And it was a full month before there started to be any resources available. Fortunately, we had small pools of money from the National Science Foundation and elsewhere, but that wasn't nearly enough to deal with the issue.
Let me ask you, Windell, since everybody else has weighed in on this, but you're down there living it, having to build levees, having to maintain levees. How does all that work in a practical level for what y'all are trying to do?
Well, are you talking about BP? Are you talking about
the entire? Well, let me ask you about the master plan. Let's kind of end there because we're almost out of town. We've talked a lot about the master plan. It's a major plan to try and restore and preserve as much as we can of our coast. From one who's living it, who's down there actually working on this, how would you describe that? Is it a good plan? Is it one we should continue to support?
It's a good plan. We need to support it, but as we implement it, again, the way it's put together, we have such a large problem with so many. Such a complex delta that a solution in one area may not serve as well in another. As we implement this plan, we need to always look at it, question what we're doing. When we're finished, question again, and adjust as we move forward. My goal, I've been sitting with CPRA from the beginning, and my goal is just to try and hold on to as much of Louisiana as possible. In my area, we continue to see loss. But our work has provided some bright spots. We've created marsh in different places. We've slowed down the loss. Garret talks about the different problems, but there's a systemic and I call it defensive. When you just go in and put a marsh where we lost thousands of acres of marsh and hadn't changed the system, same thing's going to happen. We need to incorporate the systemic losses, systemic systems to maintain some of the repair that we do. Some repair we know is not going to last forever, but nothing lasts forever. So we need to really be smart. You talked about in the promo. We need to sit down where there's a worth, and whether it be cultural, whether it be economic, we need to sit down and look at the worth. We've given up on Leeville, Louisiana. It's still a great place to fish. Tremendous productivity. But we've given up because it's not sustainable. There are other places throughout Louisiana that we're going to make decisions about. As long as we make them for the right reasons, we'll be okay.
Well, I think we've had a pretty spirited discussion. We've had some good questions from the audience, but unfortunately we've run out of time for our segment right now. But we would like to thank our panelists, Mr. Graves, Mr. Curole, Dr. Delia, and Mr. Schleifstein for their insights on this month's topic. When we come back, I'll have a few closing comments. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. And while you're there, take this month's survey, comment on tonight's show, and view the award-winning LPB documentary Turning the Tide about Louisiana's coastal erosion problems and solutions. When the Supreme Court ruled the Affordable Care Act was constitutional, it allowed states to choose to expand federal Medicaid benefits to subsidize the plan's coverage. Governor Jindal has chosen for Louisiana to opt out of the Medicaid expansion program, saying it will be too costly and inflexible. Supporters of accepting the expansion say it will improve the state's health and healthcare delivery system. Louisiana Public Square brings the two sides together next month for Medicaid expansion. Take it or leave it. Thanks for watching, and good night to you all.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.